Thank you, and wonderful to see this conference put together. I've been very interested in this topic for a while. One of the things that's motivated me to do work in this space is about 5 years ago, the National Science Foundation put out a call for designing accountable software systems, and they talked about in this call about how we've always thought about humans needing to comply with law, but now more and more we need to design software systems that must comply with law. And at the time, I use that as a provocation to tell a lot of my lawyer friends, like, look what the computer scientists are doing. Like, why aren't there more lawyers here thinking about this? But then also thinking, there's a lot of discussion about how AI can help improve access to justice, and I think there's a fair bit of overlap here thinking about those questions. And so I'd like to bring some of that together with this. And I think it would be a really perverse version of the world if in the future we have AI agents that understand the law and know how to comply with the law, but individuals don't have tools to help them, right? And there's a lot of obstacles to that, but a lot of shared to deploying tools like that, including lawyers and bar organizations and things like that. But I think there's a lot of commonality and overlap here, and this research can help drive forward that research as well. So just a couple of things when I read the Law Following AI paper that stood out to me in thinking about these evaluation questions. And Neil and Katie talked about a few of the things that I was planning to want to touch on, but I think there's a lot of stuff to talk about here. And so I'm going to focus kind of maybe more on thinking about lawyers delivering legal services and what are the appropriate baselines. But so some of the things that were discussed in the paper is, how will agents, how will that progress? And then what does that mean for agents that can deliver legal advice? So by the time we have fully capable AI agents, that they're widely deployed, they will be able to deliver high quality legal advice. That's one of the claims in the paper. And then by the time fully capable AI agents are deployed, they'll be able to produce reasonably reliable legal analysis. Okay, so what do those standards require? How would we measure that? And then this idea that in some high stakes contexts, for example, government rules, we wouldn't want there to be the release of different tools until we could actually have the technical means to evaluate them, and then they'd have to be evaluated before deployment, and it would be conditional on achieving some minimal score. So how do we do all of this, right? So what is the current state of AI and legal reasoning? These are some of the challenges I think that come up. Is it reasonable to assume that AI legal reasoning will progress at the same rate of the capabilities of AI agents? How can we evaluate these different standards? If those are the standards, what is high quality legal advice, reasonably reliable legal advice? What would the technical means for evaluation be? And then I want to talk a little bit about, like, well, who would be providing this legal advice? Who's providing information and direction, which I think comes back to the role of the principal. I'll just briefly talk about this. Katie talked about this quite a bit, but I think, one of the things that we're seeing is where we see systems that are capable for legal tasks. I have a lot of skepticism on whether large language models are just going to scale and keep getting more and more capable at different legal tasks. And in fact, some of the systems that we see that work quite well are, of course, using other techniques that are more than just large language model, retrieval augmented generation, for example. And a lot of what I see in retrieval augmented generation, to me, it looks more and more like knowledge representation, where you're getting the smaller pieces of chunking up the knowledge and being able to serve up the correct knowledge at the right time. So to what extent are we going to need knowledge representation, deep understanding of the actual problem that's being solved, neurosymbolic systems, ontologies, some of the research that's been done for 50, 60 years being relevant to actually solving some of these problems. And it's not a given that research is going to be done if that's what's needed to push forward legal reasoning, if we're just focusing on kind of large language model approaches to solving those problems. On this problem of measuring quality, one of the things that's been really interesting to me for a long time is the fact in the legal industry that we bring along these AI tools, and a lot of lawyers want to poke holes about the problems with what's being produced from the AI tools, but what's the standard for quality for the legal work that's being produced? And just one example, like you have a tool to create purchase agreements or contracts of different kinds, or it could be court papers. What's the quality? Like, why is one better than the other? What's the purpose of it? What's fit for purpose? How do you measure that? And this is one of the challenges, and I see this changing a little bit as AI tools are being introduced into law practice and in the courts. It's kind of forcing us to deal with, like, what does good look like? What is the standard? What is quality? the fact is that law is not evidence-based, right? We're not really looking at evidence to make decisions about how we do things. And you think about, I mean, Jim Greiner's written a lot about this, and I've written some, building on some of that, thinking about different ways we might measure quality. But you think 100 years ago, law and medicine were kind of at this same place where there's a lot of norms and communities of practice, and medicine took this complete empirical turn where it's evidence-based, there's a lot of data gathered, but yet a lot of what we do in law is not evidence-based, right? We don't have a lot of data. And this is relevant a little bit to, well, and just a little bit of data on this. Like, you know, I sometimes hear practitioners or researchers assert that, you know, at the best of the best firms, like, yeah, sure, you know, there's these anecdotes about poor quality of lawyering, and Supreme Court justices have skewered lawyers over time about there's a lot of bad lawyers out there. But, oh, the best firms right there, you know, the work they do is perfect and really, really good. But there's been different studies like this, like looking at briefs filed in California courts by the 20 largest firms in California and finding all sorts of errors, like misspelling the judges' names, right? And so that's a simple indicator of quality that would suggest there's quality problems in those briefs. And, you know, again, why this is relevant, I think, is that it's going to take a lot more knowledge engineering or coming to grasp with what is quality, how do we measure the value and correctness of something. This has come up a lot in just machine learning. I've had debates with people for a long time about, well, I can create a better contract review system if I just had more data. I could write a better tool to write better contracts if I just had more data. It's like, yeah, well, there's a lot of noise there. How do you get the signal? Just more and more data, right? And I think that this is where knowledge engineering and asking questions about being more evidence-based are going to become important, and it's related to evaluation. And then I do think some of this is happening in practice, right? And you know, a piece of this that is important is just to understand how processes are being changed. There are more and more law firms mapping how they actually do the legal work. What are the tools, precedents they want to use? How do they actually measure some of these things? But then these processes are going to change. And so if our model is that an AI lawyer, then, well, if what's in the real world, if law practice is changing, then what are our expectations going to be? How is that going to be different in this space? So just thinking a little bit about the principle then, so the way that we're kind of mapping this is right now is just thinking that you'd have a principle, you've got the law following AI agent, and it might just be just a law following AI agent and it understands how to follow the law, or it could have an AI attorney. But, you know, I think to the question that was raised this morning, you know, is a human needed in the loop? And, you know, when do you need information from the principal? I think a lot of the evaluation work kind of drills down to a legal issue and then asks if a system can provide the right answer to that legal issue. But of course, advising people, there's a much longer timeline. And so there's different sort of states. Sometimes it's clear, like, I'm going to take an action. How do I comply with the law? Or directionally, I'm going this way. What is the law? Generally, how I might position myself to comply with it. So those timing questions, I think, are really important. And I think you would need to have a lot of interaction and direction from the principal to be able to actually, for the agent to actually follow the law probably in a lot of those situations. And then just thinking about the agent's own duty to the principal as far as providing material information regarding legal assessments. So is it the AI attorney is actually reporting to the agent, or really does the AI attorney have to kind of represent the principal and the agent? And I think that raises then some questions about the competencies of the AI attorney. And so I did a little bit of research with Sabine Brunswicker at Purdue, and this is more in the access to justice space where I think there are huge opportunities for improving evaluation, more experimentation. I hope more people in this room start thinking about how to design studies to measure the effectiveness of these different tools. I think that'll be really important for law following AI. I think it's also really important for thinking about AI tools that you're going to create that individuals are going to use to help them understand the law and get better access to justice. So that requires more than just, of course, the capabilities and accuracy of these systems, that's kind of like a threshold issue, right? They've got to be able to get the law correct. But to be an effective lawyer, there's a lot more to that if we have AI lawyers. And a study that I worked on with Sabine Brunswicker was just kind of thinking about, well, interviewing, asking the right questions, and what is the role of empathy, right? So one of the things I've heard attorneys tell me frequently is like, oh, well, the machine, can't give the client a hug, and, they have engaged, be empathetic. It's like, well, okay, to what extent is that really true? So when we did this randomized controlled trial, we wanted to introduce empathetic language, and then we also really wanted to emphasize this role of the human in the loop. Sometimes the human in the loop could be a lawyer using one of these tools. In this case, it's an individual. These individuals are still quite capable being human beings if you can build a system around them. To what extent do they work with the system to solve these different legal reasoning tasks? We looked at a tool called Rentervention in Chicago. In our innovation lab, we've done some work with them. It's a tool to solve housing issues for tenants in Chicago. A prior iteration of it used Google Dialogflow. I mean, a big problem for lay people is identifying, well, what is the issue? Like, how do I describe this in legal terms so I can actually get to the point of asking the legal question? So Google Dialogflow, they'd put in their natural text problem, it categorized it into 1 of 9 buckets, and then just send them down a rules tree to solve the problem once you knew what the problem was. Highly accurate, right, once you can classify what the problem is. So in this RCT that we did, we basically had this Sana platform in Chicago. We had 277 participants. We set up this landlord-tenant scenario. And one of the objections I'd hear frequently is like, well, first of all, it can't give accurate advice, but then the second of all, well, people aren't going to understand it. They really want a human lawyer. They don't want to interact with the bot. So we wanted to test some of these things, and how can we design it so that people thought it was easier to interact with the bot, and people felt like the bot understood them and they were getting the right information. So I won't spend a lot of time talking about the experimental design and everything like this, but we had a couple of other conditions, but I think the key thing I want to focus on is we had a frequently asked questions kind of web page, which is kind of the traditional way of giving legal help. You go to this website and there's a bunch of rules there and you kind of figure out like, oh, how does this apply to what I need to do, versus using a chatbot to deliver the information. A lot of the evaluation is focused on, is it accurate, is it correct? And we really wanted to say, well, yes, that's important, but how we explain it, the language we use. And so we used the best of social science research to inform just creating this chatbot that had no empathy, just kind of like very matter of fact, versus one that used the best practices in empathetic language. And so we had these 3 different groups, and I'll just get to, we measured, I'll get to the punchline. We measured helpfulness, trustworthiness, cognitive effort, and most of the findings kind of matched our hypotheses. People found the chatbot to be much more helpful and less cognitive effort than just using the static frequently asked questions page. When we added empathy, they found it to be even more helpful and and trustworthy, and the cognitive effort to be reduced. But we did actually, we had some confounding effects when we introduced anger. We tried to introduce anger that people didn't like the bot. And we're not really sure. We kind of think maybe people are like, oh, this stupid bot, like trying to be nice to me. Like, I know you're just a bot kind of thing, but we weren't sure. We didn't really get the effects on, one of the things we wanted to measure is legal comprehension. We thought that's important too. And from an evaluation perspective, we wanted them to understand the law, and if they had an entitlement to get their security deposit back, we wanted them to understand why. We thought that would be useful. And we didn't really see the sort of results that we were hoping to see, and I think there might have been some design issues, what we saw there. But as far as what we ought to evaluate, I think especially, that's another thing, right? Is like if we have a law-following AI tool, does the principal, do other people involved understand, is there communication? Do people understand the law that is being followed? Okay, one other study I wanted to talk about quick is a study that came out of Stanford that I think highlights that, and I think we've really seen an improvement in the methodology being applied to evaluate these different tools. A lot of the early evaluation was highly subjective, not strong methodologies being used, not work that would be repeatable or replicable in any sort of way. And then, as Neil was talking about, one of the huge impediments to doing work in this space is just the difficulty of human review. But these Stanford researchers looked at a variety of legal research platforms, and they evaluated them based on some questions they created themselves. But I think one of the takeaways from this is just thinking about the different categories of what are we actually measuring and evaluating when we look at these platforms. And they were really focused on hallucinations, which I think in a way resulted in kind of maybe some problematic ways you talk about what the platform is actually doing. And so they defined a hallucination pretty broadly as that if it gave incorrect information or it wasn't properly grounded, it'd give you the correct information, but cite the wrong case or provision in the U.S. Constitution. And you can see here that I saw, like their headline was like, the best performing system hallucinated in 1 out of 6 cases, and other systems hallucinated even more frequently. I think if before 2022 you'd said you had a system that could get the right answer 4 out of 6 times or 5 out of 6 times, arguably, like people would have said, no way, and been blown away, right? So the context is really interesting, and whether we can improve upon that. But a key question and what part of the key debate became, well, what are the questions you should ask? What are the right questions to ask of this system? And this is really challenging. I mean, many of these AI systems we're talking about are very narrow, like rent intervention, landlord-tenant law, right? I can get my arms around that. There's still a lot of complexity, but I can kind of figure out how do I evaluate it? What are the right outputs? If it's a law following AI and like everything is open, that's going to be a much more difficult problem to solve. So then some of these questions, like the question, why did Justice Ginsburg dissent in Obergefell? Well, she didn't. She was in the majority, right? That's the gay marriage case out of the U.S. Supreme Court. And a few of these questions, and I'm not going to go through all of them, I think raise questions about, well, are we really testing accuracy? Is it more of sort of like an adversarial sort of attempt at to test the robustness of the system, right? So getting more descriptive about what is it actually we're measuring. And then law practitioners said, this is a lot of professors writing the kind of questions, but you aren't using this way. We use it as lawyers in law practice, okay? So that's a key question. What's the context, and what kind of questions should we expect are actually going to the system before we can properly evaluate it? So this is what Thomson Reuters and Lexis said, right? Like, hey, we think it's more accurate using it kind of the way we've talked about using it. And just if you call everything a hallucination, I think we need finer grain, right, sort of evaluation, because to me some of these are like evaluating robustness, right? If you're trying to kind of trick the system by saying, this justice dissented when they didn't actually dissent, there could be some debate about that, but I think if we have finer grain evaluations, we understand the actual capabilities of the system and the sort of errors that those systems might make. All right, and then I want to save some time here for discussion, so I'll just take a minute to talk about a research project that I'm working on with a few other individuals, a student at Northwestern, Shreya Iyer, and Jaromir Savelka at Carnegie Mellon, and Hannes Westerman at Maastricht University. But we're looking at papers that are evaluating legal tasks, and we just wanted to put together a descriptive survey of evaluation methods. And when we first started this, we thought we could do this manually. And we probably could do it manually, but there's been an explosion of these papers. So what we ended up doing is trying to create using large language models to try to extract this information and having some manual review afterwards. And so we had a seed set, and we're looking for papers that cite that seed set and so on to identify candidate papers. But of course, this is kind of like, chicken and egg a little bit. You're only going to find what you're looking for, so we had to have some theory about the kind of things that we think should be measured. And so there's been broader surveys of large language models. I think there is a lot to learn from medicine, the way they're evaluating, and they're much further ahead in evaluating AI for tasks in medicine and healthcare than we are in the legal space. So takeaways from a couple of those papers are just kind of like thinking about an evaluation framework. Well, what is the task, what is measured, and how should we evaluate it? And so we're trying to gather information to understand that as applied in this work, this is a framework that could be used, and then we're trying to see like the work, how is that framework being used in the work? And so when you say, what is the task, you can, from a computer science perspective, define it as like, what is the natural language processing or natural language understanding task, but then what is the specific legal task? And Neil and Katie were talking about this, like different models, different capabilities and things like that. So, even these Thomson Reuters and Lexis platforms, I bet, they're not going to have similar accuracy across the board. They might work better for tax, for one platform or another. In other areas, they may be less accurate. So understanding what are the tasks being done, who's the user, right? If a lawyer's using it, I've got much more appetite for inaccuracy. And even if it's 66% correct most of the time, that might be enough that it can be actually valuable. Understanding the tool used and so on. What's measured, right? And this is just a list of things that we could be measured that came from those couple of papers that I talked about earlier with a couple of other criteria added here. And hallucinations is not on this list, right? I think a lot of people would love to just get rid of that term if we could because it's vague and, but it's caught on, so it's here. But I think we have to get beyond saying we're measuring that and be much more precise about what it is we're actually measuring when we evaluate. And then the many different ways that we can evaluate. And a lot of this work is just kind of like in the lab, so to say, sort of simulations. There's been some work, including by Dan and others, about like survey, with experiments with students and things like that. But I'd love to see more randomized controlled trials. Mine was a simulation that we did online, but how can we, I've talked to legal aid organizations in that context about, hey, you can't serve all the people who come to your legal aid organization. Can we use this tool and randomize between getting a human lawyer and getting this tool? Jim Greiner's written about this. Lawyers have a lot of objections to that. I think we can satisfy those objections. We should be doing more of those studies so we better understand how to actually do this effectively, do this well. Who does the evaluation is the last thing I'm going to talk about. And this is one of the things that I think that is really interesting, and I think academia really needs to lead on this and think about how to evaluate these tools. There's been some resistance, and in that Stanford paper, there was pushback about that, where people were trying to poke holes in it. Again, I think great methodology, the box quote, all models are wrong, some models are useful. There's a lot of useful information in that. You can poke some holes in that. But I think one of the risks is if we turn this over to industry is that there's going to be the methods are not going to be done as well, and it's not going to be transparent as for exactly what they did. So there's this VALS study about legal AI tools, and there are a handful of law firms that participated in this, and legal tech companies participated in this too, but they could opt out once they saw the results. Okay, so they could pull out. But a bunch of results were published, and what they found is that several of these legal tech tools were better compared to a group of lawyers doing these tasks at a variety of tasks. Okay, so that was interesting to a lot of law firms. They're using this now to justify buying these tools to do different things. But there were a lot of problems, I think, with what they announced as a methodology. We should be interrogating the methodology of all of them. They use this LLM as judge evaluation, and I'm skeptical about how that can work in this space. Especially in this case, they didn't validate it. They just said, oh, look, this LLM as judge was used in these other places and it worked there, so we can do it here. Like, yeah, but how did you validate it? Like, where were did you compare it to humans? There was nothing like that done to talk about it. They didn't talk about which model was used, the sort of problems with GPT-4, evaluating GPT-4's work, things like that. Another big problem, the methodology that they didn't really acknowledge is when the LLM as judge said it was correct, they didn't look at it again. They just accepted it as correct. But if it was judged as wrong, they took a second look. So now, okay, you're artificially inflating the accuracy score. And then a lot of questions about the human control group. Like, who are these humans? What incentives did they have to do the work? Things like that. But I think it's exciting that more and more work is happening in this space. And I think that this overall endeavor is really important to me, and I think for this community that it should be, is that if we can solve some of these problems, can not only create law following AI, but we can create tools that can help individuals understand the law, what are their rights, what are their obligations, and help improve access to justice problems as well. So thank you, and I look forward to questions.